Well, I'm happy to introduce my colleague, a research fellow at the Partnership on AI, working on the About ML initiative. Jiyoo's research focuses on understanding ML documentation practices on the ground and developing implementation strategies. Prior to PAI, Jiyoo was a researcher at UCSF, where she developed software tools to make precision medicine more accessible to underserved communities. Over to you, Jiyoo.
Thank you, Sarah, and hello, everyone. I'm Jiyoo, and I'll be sharing some of the preliminary findings from my current research on the implementation challenges of ML documentation. So I wanted to explain more on what the About ML initiative is. So it stands for Annotating and Benchmarking on Understanding and Transparency in Machine Learning Life Cycles. And the goal of this initiative is to promote transparency in machine learning systems through machine learning documentation. And we really want to help bridge the gap between the principles and practice and gather some of the best practices from the practitioners on the ground and share it with the wider community so that documentation can become more of an industry norm. So we have a wonderful resource library on our website called About ML Resource Library with data gathered from experts in this field and really great reading. So Josh just shared a link in the chat, so please check that out. And why documentation? So the opacity in the machine learning systems makes it difficult to identify the potential harms and biases. And we can think of documentation as both a process and an artifact, meaning a process to help technology builders think about the ethical implications throughout the machine learning lifecycle, and also as an artifact to create transparency on the building, training, and testing of the systems, and communicate that better with diverse stakeholders like developers, consumers, or regulators. And our research builds on numerous efforts that have been happening across the field in the past few years. So really wanted to acknowledge all the work that's been done in the space. So for example, like data sheets for data sets, data set nutrition label, data statements for NLP, IBM fact sheets, algorithmic impact assessments, model cards for model building, and many more that are coming out. And because we're really interested in how these templates and processes and frameworks are implemented on the ground, wanted to highlight some work that's been done here. First is how a paper that explains how the principles, ethical principles are translated to practice and the challenges around that. And some explanation for this include misalignment of incentives within an organization, and the complexity of AI's impacts, and the challenges with identifying best practices. And the research team at IBM specifically looked at how fact sheets can be challenging to be implementation challenges around fact sheets. And they mentioned the loss of important details, concern for proprietary information, and predicting information needed for potential customers can be a challenge. In our About ML interview study, we really wanted to look at how documentation is implemented in diverse contexts. So I talked to organizations that have started the process of implementing, from startups to the corporations in different domains. And I talked to a lot of people, diverse roles involved in documentation, including engineers, data scientists, product managers, ethics legals, policy team members, and executives. And the main research questions that I want to answer through the study is, what are the current practices for machine learning documentations? What are organizational challenges for implementation and the possible solutions for these challenges? And we're still conducting this interview until the first week of December. So if your team has experience implementing documentation, we would love to talk to you. Josh just shared a sign up link, so you can register through there. And Some of the preliminary findings from my research, I've been thinking about them in three main buckets. So first around the organizational culture, and then technical barriers and practitioner challenges, meaning the challenges that practitioners face when they're actually doing the documentation. So first, around the organizational culture, I hear that documentation is still considered like a nice to have or an afterthought and not a priority in an organization. And that may be because of kind of the lack of incentives and rewards for doing the work, which takes a lot of effort. And there's generally some gaps in awareness and understanding on AI ethics and risk. And given that in an organization, there are people coming from different educational or professional backgrounds, there's still some gaps in that area. In terms of technical barriers, I've heard practitioners say that there are too many tools and templates to choose from. Our colleague Surya at the Partnership on AI is actually working on a meta-analysis of all the tools and templates out there, so that will be a helpful resource coming soon. And another challenge can be integrating documentation tools with existing tools and workflows. And some data scientists especially mentioned that switching between coding and writing when doing the documentation is quite difficult. And lastly, in terms of practitioner challenges, predicting the downstream risks and harms of AI systems can be a challenge because we sometimes don't know how these systems will act in the real world when they're deployed. Also, translating the technical information to non-technical language to diverse audiences is another challenge. And because a lot of teams have members changing or moving to different companies, tracking down information from data and model owners is something I heard a lot. And maintaining and updating documentation can take a lot of effort. So that's another thing I've been hearing from practitioners. And one of the most common challenges that I've been hearing from all stakeholders, diverse stakeholders, is just understanding the value of documentation. So that comes from many different levels. And it's important to get a buy-in from all different aspects of the companies. For example, from executives to encourage the adoption across the organization. An excerpt I heard from my interview is, at the executive level, committing to these efforts is extraordinarily important. And also from managers to allocate time and resources in the project scope. So a manager shared not just engineers buy-in, but their managers and their managers buy-in, so that everyone allocates a requisite amount of time for model documentation. And finally, from engineers to actually operationalize documentation on the ground. A manager shared with me that maybe a less seasoned engineers won't understand why that we need to document a change, like this is a quick push, we can solve this really quickly. And this leads nicely to kind of the goal of this webinar, which is to provide different stakeholders an insight into the importance of machine learning documentation and really highlight the business value of investing in documentation practices and facilitate a dialogue between stakeholders and our panelists on the benefits of documentation.